We are in the book of Hosea, and we're going to talk this morning about what I call the dangers of prosperity and the benefits of brokenness. Now, just a disclaimer before I even get into this discussion, and we'll talk briefly about the book of Hosea here in a second. One of the things when we think in terms of prosperity is there's two errors, what I'm going to call extreme errors that take place. One of those errors is this, that God, when you become a Christian, wants you to be prosperous in all things. He wants you healthy, wealthy, and wise, okay? That's the picture. That's going to be in contradiction with significant portions of Scripture. You with me? Job went through a tremendous period of suffering, as did all of the disciples who end their life, 11 of the 12, end their life being executed for their faith. That doesn't necessarily sound like prosperity to me. Paul was beaten repeatedly. That doesn't sound like everything's going well for Paul. Sometimes you might hear that called the prosperity gospel. That is, that once you become a Christian, everything's going to be okay. That's one extreme, okay? And it's, by the way, in error. God said that when we would become believers, if they hated him, they would hate us. There would be a degree of suffering in this world. The second one kind of works like this. Listen, if you are prosperous, and if God has blessed you financially and with good health, then there must be something wrong with you, okay? That's also an extreme, isn't it? And I want to qualify that this morning by looking at a passage in the book of Isaiah, that prosperity isn't the curse of God, and it isn't simply the blessing of God, but there are certain dangers that are associated with it. I think that's a better way to say it. So don't look at your neighbor down the pew and say, well, they look like they have it all together and life's good for them, and they look like they have plenty of money. I wonder what's wrong with them, okay? Don't think that way. But also don't think the way that for those who are difficult and going through difficulty and suffering, that they must not have enough faith or something. Both of those are going to be errors, okay? Now, I'm reminded of the story when the Iron Curtain fell in Russia. I remember right as that was happening that our pastor in California had a couple of Russian pastors come over to visit, and he was talking to them, and he told the story that afterwards he said, man, we are so, what you guys have done under tremendous persecution for all those years in Russia in preaching the gospel, you just need to know. Looked at him in nutshell. Let's just start reading it. Hosea chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Verse 2. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. And now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They utter mere words. With empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. Okay? You say, Pastor Phil, I'm not sure what you just read. Okay? And I understand that the prophetic books are a little challenging that way. So let's just think of it in terms of the dangers of prosperity and the benefits of brokenness. Here's our first idea from verse 1. In prosperity, we think it's all about our pleasure. But in brokenness, we are more aware of others' needs, okay? In prosperity, we think it's all about our pleasure. But in brokenness, we are more aware of others' needs. Now look with me at verse 1 again. Israel is a luxuriant vine. In other words, she was a vine that was supposed to produce. You say, well, my translation reads something like Israel is a defiled vine. Okay, the translations are different here. I'm going to explain to you how they got there in a second. But just know this. It's like you had a garden that was producing and yielding fruit. But in the end, it didn't provide any of the fruit you really expected it to. A little bit like, remember how Jesus cursed the fig tree in the New Testament time, right when he comes back into Israel, Jerusalem rather, at that time where he comes forward, the week of his crucifixion, he comes forward on Palm Sunday, and he sees a fig tree before he gets there, and it doesn't have any fruit, and he curses it, and the disciples all say, like, what just happened there, right? Jesus said, you expect it to provide fruit for you to meet your need, but it doesn't. That's a bit of what's going on here. Look at the text again, chapter 10, verse 1. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. By the way, it's not referencing altars to God here. There was only one altar that was supposed to be built, and that was in Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, which is Israel now, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah, Jerusalem's in the southern kingdom. They built their own altars so that they wouldn't have to go that far, okay? Up in the area of Dan there, they built an altar so that they wouldn't go down, and they worshiped idols there. It's not a positive thing that God says the more altars they built. And we'll talk about their pillars in a second, but before we get that, let me give you just a different translation or another rendering of that verse if I could. Israel is a damaged vine whose fruit fails him. At the time that his fruit should have been prolific, he was prolific with altars, that is, idolatrous altars. And when his land should have been at its best, they excelled with sacred pillars. That's not sacred in a good sense. That's worshiping idols in a bad sense, okay? Here's your picture. You say, well, how do you get to damaged on one side and luxuriant on the other side? And the answer to that actually has to do with one of the guys I was reading this week pointed out this way. In fact, the line means that the vine yields fruit for itself. Now listen to the line again. Israel is a luxuriant vine that only yields fruit for itself. As a vintner does not look for a vine to yield fruit for the benefit of the vine, but for the benefit of the harvest he will receive. A vine that yields fruit for itself is only taking up space that should be used by productive plants. Okay, you say, well, Phil, how does that help me? Here's what you need to understand. The nation of Israel had the ability to do production like no one else can imagine. But instead, they used all of that prosperity only for themselves. Think about it. When God has made you prosperous, you need to understand prosperity can be dangerous. All of that prosperity may mean that you and I may spend things on ourselves as well. Now remember, they built altars. Those altars were for Baal. They built pillars, like a large wooden pillar that would be raised up. That pillar was for Ashtoreth. They literally worshiped only their pleasures at these altars. In fact, when you read back through the history of this, there were sexual activities that took place all around the idea of Baal and Ashtoreth, false gods. That's why it's very easy to think that when we're prosperous, that prosperity is to be spent on our pleasures. And so they built these altars because these altars let them do that. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Here's what I mean. They moved away from the true and living God who wanted what was best for them to a false and non-existent God whom they proclaimed would do what they desired. Okay? By the way, that isn't all that far from how we start to reshape God for our desires. If you don't like what God is telling you, you just kind of reshape it and you change your theology a little bit. All of that is just like the idol worship that took place back then. Can I remind you? On a regular basis as a pastor, when people come and see me, or usually I'm going to see them at this stage, they will say something to me, even though they are in direct violation of what God has asked them to do, they will defend that position by saying, well, you know, God just wants me happy. And I'll say to them, but he doesn't want you to leave your marriage. No, but he wants me happy. Okay? So because he wants me happy, that's why I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Right? And I remind them, the Bible doesn't talk about God as if your happiness is the most important thing in your life. The Bible talks about God as if his glory is the most important thing in our life. And therefore, we do what he wants us to do. Watch this. The Israelites moved away from the true and living God, who, by the way, had blessed them with prosperity. And he wanted what was best for them. And they took on instead Baal and Ashtoreth, false gods and non-existent gods, gods that weren't even real, right? Whom they proclaimed would do what they desired. Sometimes we ask questions about all the things that are going on in the world in which we live. Things like what took place in Houston, what will shortly take place in Florida, some of the racial wars that are going on, and we start to think in terms of the fact that, listen, why is God not blessing us with more prosperity? Can I just remind you that something else happens in a spirit of brokenness? When we are broken, in prosperity, it can often be about our pleasure, but in brokenness, we are more aware of others' needs. I was reminded of this image. Perhaps you saw it on the internet this week. Daryl Hudak carrying Catherine and her 13-month son, Aiden, through waters in Houston. Can you just pause and imagine what Houston would have been like a couple weeks earlier? Cars buzzing down the freeway, no water there, no difficulty, no struggle, everything is good, right? In fact, Daryl probably could have walked past Catherine on the street and maybe not even noticed her, or Catherine might not even have noticed him. But here's the thing. When suffering hits, when brokenness hits, we are a lot more aware of the people's needs around us. In fact, I always see that as a pastor when I look at the congregation who has gone through the loss of life or difficulty or suffering or the loss of a job. It is often the people who have already suffered that are so attentive to that. Right? Often the rest of us may not necessarily even know what to say in that situation, but there is a unique attentiveness to others who are in need when we too are experiencing that brokenness or need. Israel is a luxuriant vine. What kind of vine? The kind of vine that only spends its fruit on itself. That's a danger of prosperity. We want our pleasures. That's why they build altars to their sexual gods. We don't really return it to the Lord, the true and living God. The end of verse 1, we only improve the idols that we worship. Okay, look at verse 2. The heart is false. How they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Let's talk about that. In prosperity, we are deceived that we are safe and secure, but in brokenness, we realize that we are not in control. Okay? In prosperity, we are deceived that we are safe and secure, but in brokenness, we realize that we are not in control. Remember the guy in the Gospels that Jesus talked about? He built one barn after another. He had so much stuff and so much food that he said, I'm just going to build another barn. A little bit probably like American hoarders, to tell you the truth. You can see it, right? There's not enough room in my house, so I'll move out to my garage, and pretty soon I push my cars out of my garage because I just keep keeping all these things, and then I have to build a shed behind, and then I go ahead and rent some space someplace. Why? Because we just keep adding barns after barns after barns. And God said to him, remember what God said? You fool, tonight your life will be taken from you. We think that we are safe and secure when we're prosperous. By the way, that's a deception, isn't it? Because look at verse 2. Look how he starts that verse. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Everything they had their confidence in, their false gods, God was going to destroy. In fact, here's a couple thoughts that just go with that verse. Their heart is false. What you think is true isn't. The fact that you think you're safe and secure, you're not. All of that can change in a moment. When you thought you weren't guilty, you were. Look at that. Now they must bear their guilt. Because their heart was false, they said, hey, we're worshiping these gods that we think will give us what we want. We don't even think we're guilty in doing this. And God said, no, you're going to have to bear your guilt. And finally, it's only as God destroys your strongholds that you'll see the need to reach for him. This answers a great question for us. I'm just going to go off on a 2-minute tangent. How many of you have had someone ask you, or you've thought at some stage in your life, why do bad things happen to good people? Have you ever been asked that question or thought it? Okay. Or another way to say that is, why does suffering come? Okay. So I've been thinking about that question a little bit the last couple weeks. And for what it's worth, I think the reason it's hard to answer is because it's really answered best with 2 answers, not one. And we're all laboring at trying to figure out what that answer is. So just let me for a moment have you think about why suffering happens from a 2-answer position, okay? And I'm going to divide those answers by why suffering happens to unbelievers and why suffering happens to believers, okay? And it's actually tied to this verse. Why? Because here the Lord breaks down the things that we depend upon, thinking that will make us happy. Why? So that he can communicate to us our need for him. In fact, maybe a better way to answer it is this way. The purpose of suffering for the unbeliever, this is not the believer, but for the unbeliever, is not a declaration that God doesn't exist, but a declaration that they are not in control. Right? Just think about this for a second. Often, sometimes a person will say, well, I would actually believe in God if I could answer this question, why does he allow bad things to happen? Now, just go past everything else for a moment and let's just talk about that. What if we lived in a world where nothing bad ever happened, if that's even possible because we're sinners, but what if we lived in a world where nothing bad ever happened? Would not that person struggle to understand their need for God? Why? Because they would think they were in control. Here is what suffering teaches the unbeliever. Okay? You can predict it, but you can't control it. Just say that with me. You can predict it, but you can't control it. Say it with me. You can predict it, but you can't control it. We can predict a hurricane, but we can't control where it's going to hit. Okay? We can predict a heart attack, okay, based upon your past family history, based upon what you're eating, based upon how you're exercising. We can predict it, but we can't control it. We can predict cancer by looking at your DNA and evaluating certain markers, but we can't control it. We can predict where crime might happen in this world, but we can't control it. Crime happens in the urban settings and it happens in a rural setting. We can predict, but we can't control. And so therefore, now comes suffering, and a person steps back and says, well, listen, I see all this suffering. That just means that I don't even know that God exists. And the answer to that is, whoa. The suffering is meant to teach you that you're not in control. Okay? In fact, you don't come to God by answering that question. Hebrews 11:6 says, for he that comes to God must believe that he is. It doesn't say he who comes to God must have all his questions answered. Okay? He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. You say, well, Phil, then what is the purpose of suffering? For the unbeliever, it's meant to draw them in faith to God. You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. What should draw them to faith in God is that God always is the one doing all the good things for them. Not so. Faith is not needed if it isn't up against some degree of difficulty or suffering. Faith is needed when we say, I believe God exists even though I see suffering in the world. Right? Now, your heads are probably spinning and you're saying, I got a bunch of other answers for that too. Okay, that's great. Share your answers someplace. But here's what I want you to see. For today, you cannot answer that question for an unbeliever. Because if they're trying to answer that question, they have to stop and say, he who comes to God must believe that he is. They must believe first before they'll understand the purpose of that question. Suffering for the unbeliever is meant to declare to them that they cannot control their lives or this world. You say, well, what is the purpose of suffering for the believer? Well, James tells us what? Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, for the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. For the unbeliever, it's to draw them in faith to God. For the believer, it's to deepen their faith in God. That something happens when our faith is stretched up against things that are apparent inconsistencies in our life. Our roots grow deeper. Where I grew up down in South Carolina, I had a friend who had a pecan tree, and we all of a sudden got a big wind one year, and it knocked over his pecan tree because the pecan tree had been watered so close to the surface that its roots never had time to grow deeply. Right? And so it couldn't stand against the storms. It just poosh, blew over. And he said, can you stake that thing back up? I like pecans. And we said, we can't stake it. We can stake it up, but it's going to blow right over again. Why? Because there is no depth to the roots. The depth to the roots of your faith, the deepening of your faith to steadfastness takes place when you and I are living out our faith in difficult circumstances and suffering. By the way, that doesn't mean, does it, that God cannot prosper us, but it does mean this: there's dangers with that prosperity that aren't quite the same regarding the difficulty. Let's talk about what that looks like. In prosperity, we exercise independence, but in brokenness, we serve the one who saved us. Look with me at chapter 10, verse 3. In prosperity, we exercise independence, but in brokenness, we serve the one who saved us. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord, and a king, what could he do for us? Okay. Wow. Notice, if you would, that when we are prosperous, there's a tendency to reject authority. But not only to reject the authority, see it? We have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. So this is really a spiritual issue. But to reject not only the authority, but to reject the provision, right? Look, and a king, what could he do for us? A king's role was not only to protect and to lead, but biblically, the king's role was to provide opportunities for provision for the people. Right? That was his role. And he was to make governances and laws that would allow for the provision in some way for the people. Here's what they're saying. What can a king do for us? We don't want a king. Now, by the way, if you'd have been in Israel at the time, the northern kingdom had a bunch of kings, and none of them were good kings, okay? So you might say, hey, listen, I wouldn't have wanted one of those kings either. The point is this, that they have tied this issue, Hosea makes it clear, they've tied this issue to the Lord in some way. Why? Because they're rejecting their earthly authority, because they do not fear God, and they're saying, listen, even that king, what could he do for us? I kept reading that over and over again. I kept thinking, like, where do I hear that? We have no king, we have no king, we have no king. And then it hit me. Look at this. Hosea 10:3, for now they will say we have no king. John 19:15. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered and said, what? We have no king, but Caesar, right? Can you imagine? We don't want the king that God has provided in the name of Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ. No. We'll even take Caesar, the Roman emperors who will execute us one day, okay? We'll even take them as our king. I just want you to see that when you reject the authority that God has placed over you, it shows up visibly, physically, as rebellion at some point. And it shows up as saying, I don't believe God is even providing for me. This is what we learn from the Israelites. In prosperity, this is a danger, we tend to exercise independence. But in brokenness, we serve the one who saved us. John 19 reminds us that the King of Kings came and died. The Lord of Lords came and humbled himself. He is the one at which someday every knee will bow in heaven and on earth. He is the one who gave himself. He is a king like no other. King like no other. Here's your final thought. In prosperity, we assume that our decisions have no consequences, but in brokenness, we realize that judgment is near. In prosperity, we assume that our decisions have no consequences, but in brokenness, we realize that our judgment is near. Look at chapter 10, verse 4. See how this works? They utter mere words. With empty oaths, they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. My words don't matter, they say. I don't intend to keep my promises. See, they're making decisions not thinking of the consequence. And God says to them, listen, so judgment will spring up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. Hey, let me ask you a question. How many of you have come to the realization that whether you have a garden or whether you have flowers in your front yard or whether you just have a yard or whether you don't have a yard but you drive past places with a yard, whatever the case might be, weeds grow faster than everything else that exists. Have you noticed that? Right? That the flowers are beautiful, but if you go away for a week, the weeds will outgrow the flowers just like that. Right? When I was growing up in rural Indiana, my dad had an acre or so there when we were living in one location, and he had put it into soybeans, and we'd been away, and my task as a, ninth grader or something like that, was his cultivator wasn't working properly, and he said, listen, you need to get out there and pull those weeds, like on an acre, okay? So I said, okay. I talked to my brother, and we kind of argued about who was going to do what, and we ended up out there pulling weeds. I remember putting that off, like, I'll put that off, I'll get there eventually, I'll put it off. Every day I put it off, the weeds like grew another 1.5 feet. Like, it was unbelievable. What you want to understand is this is not about weeds like sin. This is about God saying, listen, when you are making in your prosperity, you're not paying attention to your commitments, you're just putting them off. You need to understand that I can bring judgment that grows as fast as weeds. Right? And not only that, they are destructive weeds. They are poisonous weeds. And not only that, look, they're in the furrows of the field. The furrow is where you would plant. They are growing right where you intended to be productive. You put all your prosperity, all your ideas of what was going to work in this one basket. And he said, I'm growing weeds out of that thing like you can't imagine. Why? Because your confidence is again in your prosperity. It's not in me. It's a great reminder. In brokenness, we realize that the judgment is near. 2 questions. Ever notice how the weeds grow faster than what you're trying to grow? Here's the second one. Does it feel like the things you're trying to accomplish just can't seem to get ahead? Maybe you ought to ask yourself, is my confidence in the wrong thing? Does it feel like you're just laboring, and it's like a treadmill, and it's going faster and faster and faster, and you can't get ahead? What God is saying is, listen, in prosperity, we assume that our decisions have no consequences. We are dependent again on our prosperity. But in brokenness, we realize that judgment is near. Here's a thought for you. Let's just talk about that brokenness for a second. In brokenness, you may remember we are more aware of another's needs. When we have suffered, when we have hurt, our heart is drawn to somebody else who is suffering and hurting. Prosperity doesn't often provide that. There's a danger there. In suffering, we realize that we're not in control. That's one of the purposes of it. We like to think that when everything's going well, we are in control. We're deceived. We have lied to ourselves. We are not in control. That is why we need God. In brokenness, we serve the one who saved us. If everything was going well in our lives, we wouldn't necessarily think of Jesus as the king that we should be surrendering to and submitting to. We'd kind of be off doing our own thing. We serve the one who saved us, the king. We don't say, as the Jewish chief priests, leaders said, listen, we have no king but Caesar. We say we have one king, and it is him and him alone we worship. And finally, this last idea. In brokenness, we realize that judgment is near. We just can't say we make decisions without some degree of discipline or consequence. What God wanted the Israelites to know through the prophet Hosea is, listen, I'm going to take you and I'm going to have to scatter you because you are not listening to me. You're satisfied with your prosperity, but you're not understanding your brokenness. He would call us to look at that differently today.